Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today I'm reviewing the first part, or the first book of Don Quixote. I'm not sure if this counts as cheating since this has to be the whole book, but it is kind of long, so I thought I might as well give you the first part at least. So maybe this will be kind of brief, and we'll do the second part later. So the first book of Don Quixote, it's pretty interesting, the history actually behind this. So, Don Quixote is by Miguel de Cervantes, and who lived in late 1500s Spain. And he was actually a slave, actually. He was captured by the Moors in northern Africa. And I think he started writing this first book either during that time of enslavement or just after it. But either way, he ended up writing this first part and releasing it. And it was so popular that there were fake sequels that had been released, the second book of Don Quixote and all this other stuff. And so it was a total surprise how successful this first book was to Cervantes. And so he was kind of taken aback. And I think there was even some French guy who he created the most well-known copycat. And so basically because of that, he had to basically say, okay, I need to write a second part now to just make it clear that I'm the real guy, and these are all copycats. And I think I did read in the introduction here that this apparently is actually I read this on Wikipedia. This is the most translated book in the world, to the point where it's been so consistently translated, like it was done into English twice in 2020, just totally brand new translations. They just keep translating this book because it is, I will say this, my first impression of this, it is the most fun book I've probably ever read that is relatively old. And so what is it about? Don Quixote, the titular character, is about an old Spanish kind of lord living in the same time period as Cervantes in the Renaissance Spain. And this old man, Don Quixote, he basically he's kind of past his prime, in his 50s or 60s. He's not as able-bodied, but his manner is, he's surrounded by suits of armor and old swords and spears, and many books of chivalry about Amadis of Gaul, who was French, or King Arthur, or these kinds of stories, and Greek knights, and knights I've never even heard of. He's read so many of these books, and he's so old and kind of goes a little bit loose, that he decides one day in the middle of summer that, you know what, I'm going to be a knight. I'm going to be a knight like in the storybooks, not in the historical books. And so he's so swept up in this romanticism and in his old age that he goes completely delusional and goes out into the world in search of adventure and knights errantry and and things like this. And so it's kind of hard to tell because it hasn't ended yet, but it's really true what the Greeks say about how it ends will determine if it's a comedy or a tragedy, because a lot of time it's really both. It's very funny, but it's also very sad. So for example, there's one time where Don Quixote, the most popular thing everyone knows him for, and probably there's a certain painting of it, is that he's riding along and he sees these giant windmills and he says, "Ah, those are giants," and completely convinced of his own delusion, he goes and attacks them, and his spear gets stuck in the windmill, and as it's going, on the edge, it's going very quickly. It picks him off the horse and it throws him off the horse, and he lands and he like breaks a rib or something. So it's a compelling character where we're questioning whether or not he's able to see. He goes to an inn and he sees a castle. He sees a servant girl and he sees a princess or a queen, and he sees these beautiful and noble things in the world, but they're not real. And it's a question of, even if they're not real, shouldn't we also be like Don Quixote in some way? Because we should be looking for the best in things, but also realizing that they are based in reality and not what we want them to be. I don't know. It's an interesting conversation, and how your perception changes who you are. Anyway, so what happens in the book? Well, first of all, just on how the book is written, it is extremely, I've already said this, it's extremely fun to read, but it's just written very simply, I would say. And it's written in a way where it just talks about characters doing things. It doesn't go into a lot of description and detail about what things look like. It's very much about the characters and their actions, almost like a play. And apparently it's considered one of the very first novels ever written, instead of a poem or a book or an epic or something. So I think the style of this book is actually quite modern. It's very similar to what we'd find today, where Sally said to Peter, and Peter did this, and da 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 da. So that's the way it's written, and the way it starts is there's some very famous characters. So there's Don Quixote, who is this old man with a scraggly beard, and he wears his suit of armor, and he mounts his horse called, I don't know how to, but like Rocante or Rocanante. I have no idea how to pronounce it, but it's this kind of old rickety horse that can barely stand on its own legs and is tired and forlorn and a sad looking horse, and it's very appropriate for this night. And Don is able to convince one of his peasant neighbors to join him on his journey. And this very uneducated, highly manipulated and easy to believe guy, Sancho Panza, accompanies Don Quixote on his journeys as his squire. And of course, Sancho is riding a donkey. And I don't believe the donkey has a name, but you'll see, if you see an old man in an armor on a horse and a short, fat guy on a donkey beside him, you know that it's going to be this. And so basically, Don promises them, in the tales of errantry, that once the quest is complete, that the squire will have a governorship over an insula or a court or an area of land or a dukeship. And so Sancho totally believes him. It's like, oh, he's this wealthy guy, he's on his horse, and he's like, oh, okay, I'll go along. And so they go off. And so really the main focus, I think, of the book are the characters and their interactions with just all these crazy stories. And it's so impressive how, I think what I really like about this book is how Cervantes introduces conflict. And as that conflict is being resolved, there's a new character or a new conflict that comes in, either to resolve that conflict or complicate it further. So it's always something new. It's very, very fast paced, and it's fun like that. It's fun. It's just something's always happening. So some of the characters we meet are Dulciana of Toboso, who is like the servant girl or maybe a prostitute, I'm not sure, but Don is like, oh, you are the princess, you are the lady, and he's like, before I can begin my time as a knight, I need to swear myself in allegiance to a lord or a lady, and so he chooses her, and she's just like, all right, whatever, man. and they go off, and she's like, okay, whatever, and they go off on their journey. The one thing that I guess did surprise me about this book or about Don Quixote's character, is that he would have a tendency to be rather violent. So for example, he'll be like, walking across, I think it was a barber or something, and he was convinced that the barber's like, wash bowl was the helmet of Mambrino or something of this ancient artifact, and he said he had stolen it, and the barber's like, oh no, whatever, you're crazy. And just at that slight disrespect, Don Quixote takes that as an excuse to hit him as hard as he can over his head with a spear, which is just crazy. Just crazy. And so he just hits him right over the head rather violently. And some of the scenes are funny, where he and Sancho are fighting, where Sancho says, oh, you promised me this, but this is what it really is. Like, no, Sancho, you're mistaken. You see, you thought it was a barber's bowl, but we are actually in the forest of illusions, and a witch must have casted an enchantment on you to make you see things as they are in reality. Of course, the reality that Don Quixote has is complete delusion. And sometimes they would quarrel, and sometimes it would even say that in their struggles and fighting and whatever, that the other characters would be laughing, have a good chuckle at their struggle. But yeah, so there's an element of comedy in the work, and kind of stoogery, if you will. There's another episode where there's a water wheel that they think sounded like some dragon or something. There's another kind of sad part where, there's a dust cloud that Don Quixote sees a whole army of banners and sigils in, and then there's a bunch of sheep and sheep herders that show up, and he's convinced that the sheep are part of like some evil army, and he starts indiscriminately just attacking and killing the sheep. And what happens is one of the farmhands sees this guy is out of his mind, and he takes a rock and a sling and he throws it at him, and it hits him right in the side of the jaw, and it chips a couple of his teeth, and he falls off his horse. And so as much as violent as Don Quixote is, there's also equal violence that is done to him as well. So again, it's sad, it's funny, and it's extremely entertaining. And so I don't want to give away too much, but those are some examples of some of the situations that Don and Sancho find themselves in. And eventually there's actually the latter part of the first book. They end up meeting a bunch of estranged lovers, and it's kind of like there's a man who was going to marry this girl, but then he told his friend about her, and his best friend went after the girl outside of him and was forcing her to marry him, and it was a whole tragedy. And heartbroken, the man like goes to the wedding ceremony, and he's gonna do, the I object, but he chickens out at the last second because he thought that she was gonna be like, I object, and neither of them did anything. So both heartbroken, he goes into the wilderness and becomes like a caveman, crazy person, while she ends up almost wanting to kill herself. And then that guy actually leaves her for another girl anyway, and so she like goes in search of him, and it's only because Don Quixote is in the mountains and befriends this crazy mountain man that they reconnect and come together. So it's kind of this weird thing where these other people that enter into Don's life are amused by him, but also want to placate and play into his fantasies so long as it benefits them. And in his weird, overly romanticized way, he's able to actually bring people together because he's this crazy guy that everyone kind of clamors around. There's also the side story of, since Don Quixote is a lord, he has his maid and his butler and the local priest and the barber who are terrified, oh, and his niece, that he's gone out as an old man and doing these crazy, basically illegal things. Like there's one part where he comes across a bunch of slaves and he frees them all. But anyway, so the people of his hometown also go out and search for him. And when they find him, they try to like make him come back and to try to figure out a way to fix his illness. They even have a very interesting conversation where it's kind of like meta, where they say, well, which of the books do we burn? If it's the books that actually did this to him, and it's not just his old age, which books do we get rid of? And it's a very interesting conversation because between the priest and the innkeeper. And the priest says, well, you obviously need to keep the Chronicles of Rodrigo Diaz or I forget the names, but of the accounts of real living people who were historically accurate warriors or statesmen or campaigners or whatnot. And the innkeeper said, well, yeah, but I guess you could keep those, but you don't really want to burn, the stories of Amadis of Gaul and Roland the Great and King Arthur. Like, those are way more entertaining. And they're kind of looking at each other thinking, well, they are more entertaining, but now you're starting to sound a lot like Crazy Don over here. But it's true, and it's an interesting point that sometimes fiction is far more engaging to us than reality, even though reality should be more important and more relevant because those were real people. There's also another thing where Don, or Cervantes really, goes into a narrative through Don Quixote, talking about what is more noble in the Catholic pursuit. Is it to be of arms or of letters? And that's basically saying, is it better to serve as a soldier in the army or to be a priest or whatnot in the church? What better serves Christendom? And he basically concludes that to be a man of arms is much more difficult and therefore more noble in that sense. And apparently in the translator's notes it says that was an ongoing argument of the time, of the zeitgeist, that who is a more noble pursuit. And then in the latter part of the first book, it gets, I don't want to say weird, but there's basically, it devolves into like a series of side stories where there's one scenario where the priest and the barber are reading one of the books to ascertain if it's a good influence or bad influence or not. And it becomes a short story, again, of a love interest between Anselmo, Locario, and the woman. I forget the names. There's just so many names in this book. Well, there's not really that many names, but but what it is there's these two best friends and they have this girl, and the guy who has the girl is super insecure and isn't sure if she likes him or not, even though they're together, and then his best friend does not care about it at all. So he tries to set up his best friend with his fiance to prove that she's loyal, but he's so insecure that he keeps doing it to the point, and both of them say this is a bad idea. His wife doesn't know though, or his fiance doesn't know, and they get so annoyed with him that they start to bond over it. And then as soon as his friend gives him, as soon as he gains the trust of his fiance and he gets over his insecurity, they do actually start cheating on him. And I think it ends with, they basically elope. I think he commits suicide. the other guy dies in a war, and she ends up dying of heartache or something. But yeah, it's kind of like this little in like story within the story, and there's three of these in a row. Technically, there's another story about this Moorish girl called Zadia, and it's so funny because she has her translator, and she says, "Oh yeah, this is Lady Zadia who has come from Morocco or Tunisia or something." And she says, "No, no, my name is Maria." So she just chose the most generic, like Christian name possible, which is Maria. I just found that so funny. But she was so passionate about that. She came to Spain to basically be a convert. And so and then she goes into her story of how she met, and this is probably, very much related to Cervantes' life in some way, how she met the Spanish slaves and was fascinated by their faith and devotion, and so she decided to help them escape, and they all got on a ship, and anyway, so that's another kind of short story within the overarching story. And so it's interesting how we have these series of short stories where Don is kind of he's having a place in it, or or they revolve around him. Oh God, during that scene, friggin', while she's telling her story, Don is in his friggin' room at the inn, and he's convinced that the pillars in the room are giants, and he starts slashing at them crazily with his sword, and there are like wineskins up there. So all the wineskins get torn open and wine just spills all over the floor. And after he's done his delirious rant, he wakes up covered in wine. He says, "Ah, the blood of the giants." So, and the innkeeper's super furious, right? Because they're all the costs. But fortunately, Don's priest friend, is like, "Oh, don't worry. He's very rich. We can pay for everything plus damages. Don't worry about it." But but like that's just the thing. Things just keep happening. Things just keep happening, and you're just waiting to see what crazy thing Don will do next. And the way the first book ends, it's nothing super grand. They're basically on their way back. They basically convince Dawn that that one of the ladies is actually Queen Miko Mika of like Madagascar or some southern country or something, and that she needs to return and whatever, and then he can take his leave of her quest, and he'll do things where like, oh, he'll see someone in trouble, and he says, "I can't help that person yet because I'm still attached to the quest of Queen Miko Mika," and so he follows his code of knights errantry down to the T, where he thinks it's like life or death, basically. But the way it ends, they're basically going back. I think they come across some guy who's again telling his story of lost love or whatever, and Don interrupts it and says he should have done, "Oh well, you should have done this, obviously." And they have a fight, and they have a tussle, and basically Don gets home, and Sancho gets home with his donkey, and they pay Sancho some fair sum of money for his trouble, but nothing amazing. And it basically ends with Cervantes saying, "Oh yes, and Don Quixote went on many more adventures with Sancho Panza, and there was a jousting tournament somewhere, but eventually, Quixote passed away, and this is what his gravestone said." So basically, it just says Don lived the rest of his life. He got into some shenanigans here and there, but eventually he passed away. And so it's kind of Cervantes saying, "You know what, I think I've had enough little fun stories writing about this character, having him be fun, and now I think it's time to put him to rest," basically. So just quickly, just as a kind of a wrap up saying like, all right, well, whatever, this is done. And so this is what it says on Don Quixote's gravestone, the epitaph. "The numbskull who so bravely draped La Mancha with more rich spoils than Jason brought to Crete. The mind that deemed the pointed vein to be needed when something blunter would be meet. The arm whose mighty power extends so far that from Cathay to Italian Gaetus shore came the most awesome muse, the most aware, who e'er graved verses on a plaque of bronze, he who left each Amadeus behind, who turned his mighty back on Galaor, and vanquished all in valor and in love, causing every Belians to fall mute, who mounted Roxanante and went erring, lies here beneath this cold and marble stone. And that was the intended end for Don Quixote. But it was so popular that he, as I said, was forced to write a second part, which I will get into. Well, I've already actually got into it, and I'll probably can read that pretty quickly. You know, even though this book is like 800 pages or so, which is fairly large, I'm going through it very fast. This is probably one of the fastest books I've ever read, because the words just flow off the page. If there was a way to write like this, I would learn how to do it. This is probably one of the best or most fluid written books. It's so easy. And it's weird because Don Quixote, I obviously read a lot of things which are culturally important, and a lot of them are very heavy, hard to read things. If I were to compare Don Quixote to what we have now, it's not as mindless as a Marvel movie. It's not as nuanced as some weird esoteric anime. It's more kind of like, I don't know, almost like Brooklyn Nine-Nine or The Office or something between. It's almost like a sitcom, but serious enough that it's not. So I'm thinking of something like, I don't know, Firefly or something. Not to give you too high expectations or different expectations, but that's the feel that this book has. It feels like an episodic TV series that's funny, but not just an episodic sitcom. It kind of is an overarching thing where it goes somewhere. And it's just incredibly entertaining. Not exactly a deep thought, but actually very fun to just read. So yeah, this is something I would 100% recommend to almost anyone of any reading level. I think even if you are a kid in middle school, you could probably take this on. The vocabulary is not too crazy. There might be some odd words here and there that are just outdated, because I was reading this and I was like, what is errantry? What is whatever? Someone also brought up to my attention that there's a 1970s like live stage play called Man of La Mancha, where they just did the American version of this or something. So this kind of character, you'll see him, I would say, in lots of different media, where he's like the slightly different, but he'll be like the super macho, super self-assured character who actually is completely deluded and doesn't know what he's doing, kind of like a Johnny Bravo. And you'll see that kind of character in lots of different shows or games or whatnot or what have you. And he'll usually show up as a side character, not the main character. But that kind of staple and trope is, I think, derived kind of from this, the kind of crazy guy who some might know what he's doing or doesn't know what he's doing at all. Anyway, not much else to say. It's a great book. So far, book one was great. I'll see how book two lives up to Cervantes' legacy. And yeah, that's it. See you later, guys, and always keep reading.